Now I want to take a moment to recognize the passing that's hit us all hard in the Little Rock preservation community. This summer we lost a legend in Richard Butler. He and his family were longtime supporters of the QQA, and he's already dearly missed. We wanted to give a friend of his, Carl Miller, an opportunity to provide a tribute.
Well, Richard was a man that had many interests. And then an avocation and an important part of his life was preservation in saving the built past. And I think that's what we're going to talk about today. This is what I've been asked to talk about because it is a tribute to Richard and what his restorations have been, particularly in Little Rock, Arkansas. But to do that, we need to go back. This has been over 50 years now. He bought his house in 1968, the same year I bought mine. And at that time, I want to give you a little flavor of what it was like in Little Rock in the 1950s and 60s. It was an exciting time. We had just graduated from high school in the early 50s, and they were already putting in the Interstate 30 through town at that time. And then we all went to college, and some went to the armed services, and when they all got out and got back, it was late 50s, early 60s. And since the freeway had gone through, it had taken quite a few buildings in its swath through there. And at that time, there was no restrictions. You could just take it with eminent domain and go on and build whatever you wanted to. Well, then Little Rock Board decided they wanted to be part of the urban renewal program that was starting in Congress. And they decided, and they were one of the first cities to, not the first, but one of the first to accept that program. And the fortunate thing about that program was, you can talk about it any way you want to, and we don't want to waste a lot of time about that, but they did have a component in there that they wanted a committee to be formed in the city of about 7 people, they suggested, and they were to determine what were the most important structures in the city. Now this I'm getting from Dana Nixon's history of the Quapaw Quarter, which is very good, and I recommend that you read it if you haven't. But, so the committee was formed. And you have to think now, remember, before this committee was formed, the only 3 structures that really anybody have thought about of value in the city of Little Rock was the U.S. Arsenal building, MacArthur Park, where General MacArthur was born, the Territorial Restoration, now the Historic Arkansas Museum, and the old State House. And you'll have to remember also that those places were recognized and almost torn down in the 30s and 40s. But here is an example of where women stepped in and stopped it. And I mean, they really did stop it. They worried their husbands to death and the legislature, and they got those projects stopped, and money to, at first, begin to restore them. There was Ms. Lower at the old State House, and it was Ms. Loughborough at the Territorial, and it was Bernie Babcock at the Arsenal. Now, there were some other places that were saved that time in Arkansas, but those were the only really places that anybody really recognized. And so one thing urban renewal did, it began our idea of preservation of the built environment and rehabilitation of structures that were no longer useful as a single residence, but repurposed them. And so Richard came back to Little Rock in that atmosphere. He had been to college and obtained his attorney's degree and went to work with his father in his firm. I had come home from engineering and was working in our family business. And we knew each other from our church because we both went to the same church. So QQA then, this division of the Housing Authority, the Urban Renewal, a man named John V. Robinson came to them as the director of that. And he formed this early committee. I wasn't part of that. I didn't know him then. And then they expanded that committee a little bit. And after they had picked the 11 properties, and there's a lot of stories about that too that are interesting, but we won't go into that right now. Then they began to make their plans, because you have to plan on all this urban renewal before you can actually implement it. And so as time went on, the QQA was not incorporated at the time, but they did have tours and they did give some plaques away. Well, Mr. Ed Cromwell was a leading architect here in Little Rock, and of course everybody was so excited about the fact that urban renewal was going to take down a lot of properties, and they were going to rebuild a lot of properties. In other words, the realtors were happy, the architects were happy, everybody was really happy at the time, and it was exciting. And Mr. Cromwell said, you know, I think there's money there from this urban renewal to rehab some of these houses in the area over by MacArthur Park. So he bought several houses between 9th Street and 11th Street and Commerce and Cumberland, and he began to rehab them. And one of those houses he rehabbed was called the Furling House at 9th and Rock. It's on the southeast corner. And Richard Butler decided that's where he wanted to live when he came back to Little Rock. He didn't want to live at home out in West Little Rock. He wanted to come back downtown and live there. And by the way, that's where, when Mr. Cromwell did those apartments, a lot of the children of the people that their families had lived downtown but moved out west, the children wanted to come back down and live in those small apartments. And so they did. Well, he rented a small apartment. It was a 4-apartment unit at what we call the Furling House, there at 9th and Rock, 10th and Rock, I'm sorry. And now let's leave Richard there just a minute and talk a little further now about the urban renewal and Mr. Cromwell. The committee on the urban renewal, there were a couple of people, Peg Smith, and which we have an award, QQA has an award for that, and Mary Fletcher Worthen, and a woman named Becky Moore. They decided, Mr. Cromwell suggested they buy some houses and rehab them. Well, they said, well, we can't do that, but we might be able to get some money together to buy some houses and maybe resell them to someone who will do that. So they pooled their money and they bought and sold a few houses, and they found this one, the Cadle Cottage at 417 Rock Street. And they knew Richard Butler, and they thought, now this would be a good project for him. And so they cornered him one day and suggested he needed to look at this Cadle Cottage, and they took him down there and showed him through it. He was still living there just down the street at the Furling House. And all of a sudden he bit, and they were delighted that he bought the house. Well, then after he bought it, he said, well, now what am I going to do with this thing? So he had a party, and it was a suggestion party. And some others have had those since that time, but he was the first one to have it. and he just cleared everything out and had everybody suggest things. And you cannot imagine what some of the things they suggested. Burn it, tear it down, all this. Some said restore it, some said make it into apartments. He kind of knew what he wanted to do with it though, and that was restore it and live there, which they were really glad. The women were really happy about that. So he hired one of the Cromwell firm's younger architects, John Trumper. And now, just before that, John Trumper had restored the Trapnell Hall for the Junior League. So that's another women's group. They decided part of the urban renewal they would do is something in the preservation field. And so this is the first restoration, major restoration by a private group, was the Trapnell Hall. And John Trumper was the architect for that. Then a private man, Mr. James W. Strong, bought the Villa Marie at 14th, Bates now, and Scott Street. And he used John Trumper on that project. So Richard decided, well, John Trumper be the one to use. Now these were done previous to 1968. And so he used John Trumper. When I bought my house in '68, I decided to do it on my own, and that was a job too. But Richard used he went the architect way, and I don't know if he ever had some money from the urban renewal part or not. I never did know. But it was available at that time for these houses. So they restored the house, and he began living there. Well, then after a little while, he decided that the house next door on the east was for sale. So he bought that house, and he had Tommy Jameson restore that as the architect. Then he bought there was a Cadle cottage next door to him. He thought his was the first. But when he bought the one next door on the west side of him, he found out he wasn't in the first, he was in the second. It was a little smaller house, and it was in really bad shape. And Tommy Jameson did that one. Tommy Jameson did that one for him too. And then he ended up buying the Furling house. So he finally ended up with all 4 houses on that block, which was very nice, and he had control of them, and he could take care of them. And over the years, he, of course, rented them. But then in later years, he decided he wanted to buy a house over on 17th and Main, at 1620 Main Street. The first Hotze house, H-O-T-Z-E, not Hotze, but Hotze. And that house is behind the second Hotze house, which faces on Louisiana, at 17th and Louisiana. A great big turn-of-the-century mansion. But this is an 1865 house or 66, we're not sure just what. Anyway, that he bought and restored it. And there he used John Gerard in that restoration. And of course, along the way, after he had restored the Cadle cottage, he decided, and this has been the trademark of preservation all along. You know, these houses were, when they were new and used in the 19th and early 20th century, there weren't restaurants to go to eat, and there were not clubs and things as much. So you entertained in your homes, And that's what everybody liked to do downtown, is entertain in their homes after they were restoring or while they were restoring. People helped each other. It was really a wonderful time. And so he started a 12th night party that he had every year. And he started it in the Cato Cottage. And then it just kept repeating it every year. And then he began to have it in other venues where people had restored houses, such as Trapna Hall and Curran Hall, the Woman City Club, and things like that. And that really was a trademark of Richard's, and it was something that helped the community feel cohesive together, because they were being able to socialize. And during this time, there was quite a few years between the Cato Cottage on the Rock Street houses and the Hotze house. And in between that, he bought some properties in Washington, Arkansas, and moved some properties from farms that the farmers wanted to tear down into that area. He moved the Wolf Store, a great big building, the Coulter Cottage, a big house, a wonderful house, a big barn, some log houses. He just was an amazing person in the preservation field. And I'm glad we're honoring him right now, because it's been overdue. It really has been. And Richard and I rather agreed on each other. We agreed that we owe the future generations more than just heritage that is not, in other words, we owe future generations a physical heritage example, rather than just printed words and pictures in a history book. Richard was an amazing person in the preservation field. And I'm glad we're honoring him right now, because it's been overdue. It really has been.
Given Richard Butler's clear dedication to the QQA and to the preservation of historic properties around Arkansas, the QQA board unanimously approved renaming our annual Awards of Merit the Richard Butler Awards of Merit beginning this year. We felt it was very appropriate that his name and legacy be reflected in the name and on the award certificates from now on.